2014, sleeper tragedy PT hit the PlayStation 4, and only the PlayStation 4. PT was possibly the cheekiest implementation of a playable teaser, hence the acronym, I've ever seen, developed by Hideo Kojima and crew under the pseudonym 7780 Studio, with help from acclaimed film director Guillermo del Toro. And on August 12th of this year, it will be PT's 10th birthday. The concept behind PT was very simple, yes, but akin to the humble cheesy beanie, PT's formula made it easy to refine and resulted in one of the most famous, beloved horror games of all time, despite being beatable in around 30 minutes with the right know-how. As I've always said, horror is better in shorter bursts, and you'd have to look far to get a more successful horror than PT. PT focuses on the journey of our protagonist who wakes up in a concrete room and soon begins an unforgettable journey through the nice but very untidy parquet-floored L-shaped corridor of a home belonging to a woman named Lisa. She's nice. This journey takes us through the corridor once, twice, many times. The corridor loops infinitely, changing slightly every time you solve another incremental step of the overarching puzzle of PT. Like returning to the House of Hades between every run, each loop through the House of Lisa drip feeds us another chunk of delicious horror storytelling, only thankfully a little more efficiently. I can't believe it took me 70 runs before Achilles would get his bone on. The player is also drip fed the aforementioned Lisa, a nightgown damsel and host of the century. A gaming monster so genuinely simple in her presentation, Lisa comes floating towards you in her blood-soaked dress and triggers a bowel evacuation so intense that you have to throw the chair away. We've done Scary Girl in Nightgown hundreds of times, and yet Lisa's execution is so hauntingly terrifying that you may as well close application the moment you see her, lest she put the extremities of your heart rate to the real test. These moments occur after minutes of protracted, unbearable tension. Despite its short runtime, PT is slow. It's a slow game. It exhibits the kind of restraint you don't see much in horror. It's only when you begin to interact with the limited environment that you unravel the tragedy around Lisa's death that the door unlocks and you are free to leave. The game ends on a cutscene featuring Norman Reedus' face. The ultimate prize. Although this game can be beaten in roughly 30 minutes should you know what you're doing, less experienced runs of the game span an hour 30 to 2 hours, and according to howlongtobeat.com, the completionist playthrough, whatever that means, will run you a hefty 4 hours. Huge swathes of time spent playing PT is spent in excruciating stillness. The only noises are your own footsteps, the distant squeaking of a gate outside, the blurting of the radio, and the occasional groanings of the house, be them supernatural or otherwise. When I decided to write this video, I went back to watch some playthroughs to refresh myself and had to watch them with my browser scrolled down so that I could only see the bottom third of the video. Even then, any jump scare would ruin my life. Still, PT wasn't the end of the line. It wasn't long until a new successor took first place. Brilliant. Sort of. I mean, you say compelling puzzle horror, I say fun and accessible app you can use to teach yourself fantastic new STEM skills with a sprinkle of critical thinking, be it for the purpose of building a new career or cultivating one you already have. Just like the looping corridors of increasing complexity we find in PT, Brilliant delivers a brand new lesson to your door every single day. Just like figuring out obscure radio frequency puzzles, you could be unearthing the secrets of maths, data science, AI, and programming with Brilliant, with hands-on methods that encourage active learning. They're also very fun. Just like the overwhelming, oppressive hauntings of Lisa, Brilliant is constantly surprising you with new bite-sized methods of interactive learning. Don't worry about failing a puzzle. Unlike Lisa, Brilliant allows you to learn at your own pace. No one is getting jump scared on Brilliant for taking too long, and you don't need to spend 400 quid on an old PS4 either. Brilliant is accessible from anywhere, anyhow. In fact, new content is always being added to Brilliant. There's no need to sit around waiting on Silent Hills or Konami news when you can be tackling entirely new learning courses every single month with Brilliant. Try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days by visiting brilliant.org/merkkk. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring today's video. PT captures a unique tension most horror games could only dream of. The tension of PT serves as one of the two barriers to its completion, the other being the puzzles. There's no combat in PT, no inventory, no difficulty settings, no New Game Plus. It is a big, scary puzzle. If you can bring yourself to overcome the fear and face the corridor and uncover the clues that lead to PT's ending, you still have to figure out how to progress the game, a significant challenge in and of itself, ghostly jump scares notwithstanding. Scavenging through forums on the topic, the player base was fairly split on on how difficult the logic of PT was, some insisting that it was impossible without a guide, others insisting that a thorough searcher would find everything they'd need without a guide. Consequently, PT was a game you didn't appreciate until it was over. Too scared to enjoy it for what it was on a first playthrough, PT's masterclass in thick, miserable tension is something you can only really look back on and admire in hindsight. This is a game designed to be missed. You can replay PT as many times as you want, or you could, I guess, but with puzzle-heavy games, your resulting playthroughs become an exercise in repetition. There may be extra fragments of information to glean from repeated playthroughs, but largely a replay will see you cycling through the same motions, reliving a mere shadow of that first terrified shuffle into the bowels of Lisa's domain, clinging to that lightning in a bottle. And this is completely intentional, or at least I think so. See, Konami hates making games. They let their best franchises rot, they biff the easiest money-making projects, and they exile their most prolific directors. Kojima was arguably the best thing that could have happened to them, and they treated him like shit. But will they sell their IPs to companies that would die for an opportunity to do them justice? No, they used them to promote pachinko machines and spas. PT was possibly one of the most incredible successes of publisher Konami's tenure, so naturally they had to shut it down. They wiped it off the PS4 store and announced the cancellation of the project. Even if you owned it, you couldn't download it. PT was made unplayable on the PS5, and Silent Hills was no more. The internet was in pieces. PS4s that still have a copy of PT downloaded can and occasionally will go for hundreds of dollars. Petitions happened. A one-to-one remake was created for PC. Begging, pleading, shitting, farting, nothing. And eventually copycats began to spring up across the gaming sphere, most of which eventually shrank back into obscurity when well-intentioned but rookie developers realised that making games is really hard, and presumably making AI like that of PT's Lisa was probably super duper hard. But one remained. Initially slated for release in 2017, Visage wouldn't see any kind of initial release until October 2018 when it stumbled onto the scene as a playable demo. Visage staggered out of the gate as a fully fledged game in October 2020 on PC, PlayStation and Xbox. Eurogamer bizarrely praised it as the best Silent Hill emulator of the last decade, a statement I could write paragraphs about and yet simultaneously find myself speechless on. No Silent Hill game plays even remotely like PT. Also, where are the vagina monsters? The rest of the reception was mixed. The story was roughly praised, the control system was panned across the board, but the horror itself was the standout. Visage was explicitly inspired by PT, from waking up in the same kind of purgatorial concrete room to being chased by a begowned spectacle of womanly horror. Visage pays homage to PT across the explicit-implicit spectrum. But that's not all this game is. I imagine it began as a project intended to reignite the excitement lost when PT was wiped from existence, but soon grew to become far more than that. To be clear, I consider it so applaudable to try and walk in the footsteps of one of the most famous horror fumbles of all time. However I criticise Visage from here on out, please keep in the back of your mind that I think this is a pretty sick game in all aspects, and the developers of this game need to be applauded for their efforts, because Visage was made with a lot of love, and that is so plain to me. Today we're going to unpack Visage, understand it, appreciate the love, care and inspiration that went into it, critique it, and cast an eye on what PT could have been 10 years later. Also, if you'd like to see a video of me literally playing this game and earning the 100%, check it out in the link below or on my other channel, I'm So Done With Gaming. Visage takes place in a massive suburban home in the 1980s. Any and all exits are locked, and our player character doesn't seem desperate enough to leave that he considers smashing any glass to escape. Most of the game's story occurs in this house, albeit with a few differences in architecture as the game ticks along. Occasionally we will leave the house and be forced to explore new areas, graveyards, hospitals, big rooms full of cupboards and jump scares, etc. The house is ludicrously big. Visage comprises 4 parts, the clearly signposted and segmented chapters of Dolores, Lucy, Rakan, and a semi-secret 4th chapter featuring Dwayne, our main character. He goes through the game unravelling the stories of the other 3 victims of this ghostly home in no particular order, except finishing the 3rd will just land you right back on your bum in the cold twilight. Should you understand this is because there's more to be uncovered and not just because Visage is now facilitating ghostly endgame free roam like some kind of suburban Far Cry, you might continue to explore the house. Perhaps you'll take a sledgehammer to that strange bit of wall down in the basement. Perhaps you'll find some VHS tapes to play in the TV room. Perhaps you'll make a hot chocolate. Either way, the only way to complete Visage is to perform tasks outside of the named chapters, and there are a couple of potential endings to blunder into cluelessly. And blunder you will. Visage's map is absolutely sprawling. Very little is told to you, which I'm kind of 50-50 on. I don't mind the endings being so obscure that they're basically afterthoughts for most players. I imagine many people who pick up Visage end up eventually just leaving it behind without finding a proper conclusion, wondering occasionally why the game has no ending, or maybe no story in the first place. Upon completing each chapter of Visage, you'll get a keepsake from each of the ghosts. Dolores' mirror, Rakan's Game Boy or something, I don't know, I didn't pay attention, and Lucy's entire jaw. These go into the progress room and serve no purpose beyond being medals demonstrating your bravery and or the thing you look at when you return to the game a year after putting it down to check where you left off. While the progress room appears to be like a safe room from Resident Evil, you can get horribly jump scared in here just as easily as you can be horribly jump scared anywhere in Visage. Sorry to say. Honestly, thank fuck Visage has a little visual cue when you're hovering over things you can interact with. Judging from developer comments we'll look at later, I do believe there may have been a stage in development where it may not have existed. I hate games with no visual indication that you're hovering over something you can use, so you just end up blundering around pressing everything just in case. In the real world, sure, I can work my way around a kitchen turning on coffee machines and opening doors until I find what I'm looking for, but when games don't tell you something's clickable, it's just an abstract waste of time. Anyway, tangent. Sorry, let's get back to it. The reason I blow through this rant so offhandedly is because the 3 chapters of Visage begin with interacting with benign items in the environment. Dolores' chapter starts when you interact with a pair of keys on a hook. That's fine, pretty obvious. Lucy's when you inspect a panther drawing on her door, and Rakan's is accessed by interacting with a crutch leaning on the stairs. It took me ages to find it, that crutch blends in so well. Upon interacting with each item, the game will warn you that you're about to start a chapter, and you can accept or back out if there's more aimless wandering you'd rather be doing. That being said, you'll probably get some of the best aimless wandering of all time in Visage, if nothing else. The 3 chapter items are found in the foyer in Lucy's room, meaning you need to brave the full length of the house before you're even able to start a story segment. You can also actually genuinely die before you ever start a story segment too. Hint, fiddle with the radio for a while, you'll see what I mean. Visage is a rough go, I'll tell you that, and this is where my first attempt at the game came to a sweaty, shaking end. Visage could never be boring, even in moments of intense, protracted frustration. The house is illuminated by clinical, eerie blue lighting. Despite being the colour of sky and water, an excess of blue lighting makes a place feel cold and harsh. If you manage to get the good boy ending of Visage, you'll see that this house actually does look pretty nice when the sunlight is streaming in through the windows and old ghostly women aren't grinning at you. But in the meantime, what isn't lit like a veterinary surgery room is draped in shadows so tenebrous that anyone could be hiding there and you'd never know. Similarly to Madison, a game whose atmosphere I also spent an enormous amount of time slobbering all over, Visage is filled with grimly effective sound design. Visage is swamped with silent stillness. It's the middle of the night, so no birdsong, cars, or chatter. The house is absolutely empty and still. Any noise pierces the air like a gunshot. The floor under you creaks as you walk, only drawing your nauseous attention to moments when it creaks the next room over or above you. Gates screech, the house settles around you. As the game ramps up, nails scratch on the other side of locked doors. Radios and TVs turn on, doors open and close, and every time they do, you jump out of your skin. And because of this, I remember walking down into the family room and tensed so tight my spine took on the same concrete constitution of my mum's famous well done congratulations steak dinner. A light bulb popped above my head and the suddenness of it almost put me in hospital. And that was the extent of my time solo with Visage. I returned with 2 friends later, pitching the game to them at a sleepover casually. I was like, oh, I heard of this cool horror game we could try. It's like, no, it's cool. Like, I already own it. I happen to have it. We could give it a go. We could totally give it a go. It'd be so fun. Like, I wasn't desperate to see the game pan out without having to hold the controller myself. So this chapter is mega dark. It's the darkest of the 3, and we're going to cover topics like dementia, miscarriage, stillbirth, and suicide by hanging. If you can't be asked with that today, skip to the Lucy chapter using the timestamps, because this is going to be dark the whole way through. It was only in April of this year that I got my chance at playthrough number 3. Feeling like I'd left unfinished business behind, I turned to my boyfriend and I said, let's do this like a rally race. You drive, I direct. And finally, we sat down and cracked on with it. This time, we blew the dust off Visage and went straight to Dolores' chapter first. And that's good, because her her chapter turned out to be my favourite. Dolores inhabited the house in 1962. Her chapter is the closest to Visage's initial inspiration PT in that you wander through this subtly changing house, uncovering incremental clues as a ghostly woman haunts the life out of you. There's even baby imagery, despite her being visibly elderly and clearly suffering from dementia, or maybe there's baby imagery because she is suffering from dementia. This chapter for me is the scariest because there's far more time and effort put into facilitating random scares around the house than there are with Lucy and Rakan's chapter, and these scares really get you. Dolores can chase and haunt you, yes, but I found that she is a far less aggressive entity than Lucy, who we'll discuss later. It's more likely that you'll round a corner and see Dolores for a split second in the kitchen, making you jump out of your skin. She can also do that in the garage. Sometimes you'll see her squirming under a bed or hanging from the ceiling if you look up. This woman had me screaming. She can blow a bulb in the basement and then speed past you in the dark. Her face can fly at you out of the screen in the TV room. Her section of the game is chock full of horror moments. Sometimes though I won't be looking in the right direction when she spawns and the game will make a noise but I'll miss the scare, and I'll be standing there just looking at magazines like, well, I won't be turning around now, and I'll just stay there and wait for shit to settle before I turn around, and then I turn around and she's just stood there and I scream again and I go and play Overwatch for the rest of the night. Dolores' chapter is the most visually intriguing and weirdly also the most grounded. Whilst Rakan's chapter is so left field that it may as well be a different game, and questions about the exact nature of Lucy's demons are never answered throughout the course of Visage, Dolores' problems are clearly demonstrated to us in every possible way. Some of you will be familiar with Everywhere at the End of Time by The Caretaker. This set of albums is split into 6 segments, summarised pretty well in an r/let's talk about music post by user Tabot, which I'll link below. Tabot describes that the album uses music to demonstrate the process of dementia for a dementia sufferer. It's a gradual but terrifying deterioration of the human mind consisting of confusion, failed remembrance, terror, and eventually a complete loss of self. The set of albums is 6.5 hours long, each of the 6 parts representing a separate stage of dementia. Quoting explicitly from the description of the album itself, as can be found in the description of the music's YouTube video, in stage 1 we experience the first signs of memory loss. This stage is most like a beautiful daydream, the glory of old age and recollection, the last of the great days. Stage 2 is the second stage of self-realization and an awareness that is something wrong with a refusal to accept it. More effort is made to remember, so memories can be more long form with a little more deterioration in quality. The overall personal mood is generally lower than the first stage and at a point before confusion starts to set in. In stage 3 we are presented with some of the last coherent memories before confusion finally rolls in and the grey mists form and fade away. The finest moments have been remembered. The musical flow in places is confused and tangled. As we progress, some singular memories become more disturbed, isolated, broken, and distant. These are the last embers of awareness before we enter the post-awareness stages. Post-awareness stage 4 is where serenity and the ability to recall singular memories gives way to confusion and horror. It's the beginning of an eventual process where all memories begin to become more fluid through entanglements, repetition, and rupture. Post-awareness stage 5 contains confusion and horror. More extreme entanglements, repetition, and rupture can give way to calmer moments. The unfamiliar may sound and start to feel familiar. Time is often spent only in the moment leading to isolation. Post-awareness stage 6 is allegedly without description, because it represents the stage of dementia with no return. Dementia jokes are so frequent that I think it's easy to underestimate what a terrifying disease it is. There's no cure, nor even treatment for dementia. While the album tries to represent what the end stage of dementia might feel like, we never truly know, because nobody's ever come back for it, and so it is literally without description. The album obviously ends in death, but beyond that, this is mainly speculative. I feel like much of Dolores' section takes place somewhere between the world of Visage and her own mind made manifest. Although Dolores suffers from multiple mental illnesses, dementia is clearly the severest of the lot, and has the most impact both on her personal story and how that story manifests for us as we play. In Alzheimer's, the most common form of dementia, the brain physically changes. This is called brain atrophy. As neurons are injured and stop working properly throughout the brain, connections among networks of neurons may break down and many brain regions begin to shrink. Symptoms of dementia might evade notice for a while because short-term memory is affected most significantly, but long-term memory tends to last. So you can recall things from a long time ago, but you might not know where you've left your keys. This makes sufferers expect to see friends and family as younger people, causing confusion. They they might also want to go home, to their childhood home, and become confused and agitated in a current home that they don't remember. This manifests so strongly in Dolores' story. Some rooms are significantly older than the rooms of the modern house they're adjacent to. It is generally understood across the fandom that Dolores and her husband had a baby together, which dies from negligence after Dolores kills George and then herself. However, due to Dolores' age, I personally don't believe that the baby was ever alive. In my interpretation, Dolores deals with the lingering trauma of having lost a baby. I think that Dolores had a stillbirth much earlier in life. During her segment, we can encounter her in the confessional. She asks us to bring her the child. When we fetch the baby, it seems to be living, but by the time we have carried it all the way to her, it's clearly dead. She says, "Bring me my baby," but we can hear her fall to pieces when we hand her the child, echoing perhaps how the baby was presented to her after she went to the effort to give birth to it. Moreover, there are moments in Dolores' chapter when we are led around the house via what most guides refer to as intestines or roots or vines, long black trailing cords of meat. They're umbilical cords, obviously, except they are black and rotten and dead. To me, this indicates that the baby died before birth. Dolores' chapter occurs in the 1960s, meaning that she would have been medicated for her mental illnesses during a time when many medications were dangerous and or experimental. Maybe the medications Dolores took for her multiple mental illnesses caused stillbirth. The medicines would have entered her bloodstream and travelled to the baby through the umbilical cord, potentially causing harm. Moreover, Dolores still has baby monitors, cribs, and toys in her own bedroom that seem as though they were never used. The baby that Dolores remembers might have been a pregnancy that resulted in a stillbirth when she was significantly younger, considering a woman her age looks like decades beyond menopause. And I think this is due to Dolores' late-stage dementia. When embarking upon her puzzles, we find that much of Dolores' story sees us bumbling through segments of the house that warp and change. One corridor has us walking in circles over and over and over again around the same corridor, waiting for something to be different so that we can leave. Another segment of this chapter has us reaching the same intersection in the house, turning a different way each time, but always arriving back at that one intersection. Clocks on the wall always show different times. We have to use mirrors to wander the house, as most of the doors are sealed shut, probably by George so that she couldn't get into the kitchen to hurt herself. We drop through a hole where the toilet should be to wind up in the progress room. We smash a mirror in the office to wind up in the library. Nothing is straightforward in Dolores' story. Despite the house also being Dwayne's, and by extension ours, we stumble through it and get lost endlessly. The more you read about dementia, the more haunting and upsetting Dolores' story becomes. Dolores isn't an evil woman. She's very lost, very scared, and she is suffering from a disease that, to this day, has no known cause or treatment. People suffering from dementia often assume that those around them are trying to do them harm. We play from the perspective of George at one point. When Dolores asks us to fetch her some tea, we grab a tea box from the attic. When we present this tea to her, she clubs us over the head, assuming we are trying to kill her. Although inspecting the tea after we escape will suddenly show it to be a box of rat poison, inspecting it again will reveal that it was always just tea. The box temporarily, physically becomes rat poison to us because we are playing in Dolores' mind. This is something she stabs her husband to death over. Dolores' section of Visage also has a heavy emphasis on music. According to charterresearch.com, researchers are finding that regions of the brain that help us encode music-associated memories are the last to go in Alzheimer's, even those in later stages of Alzheimer's. Music helps people connect with the memories they still have. Dolores has a music box in her master bedroom. We also have to use the phonograph in the basement to play vinyls multiple times, and these phonographs make an appearance in the tragic culmination of Dolores' personal story. Quite unfortunately, the part of Dolores' section I found to be the most fun, gameplay-wise. During her section, the house twists and warps in spaghettis in all directions. By the culmination of her story, music plays in a huge, echoing hall full of doors to nowhere and stairs that stretch up far beyond reach, representing the final stage of Dolores' dementia, where her own world is just disconnected, confusing paths to nowhere. Nothing exists to her beyond a few feet in each direction anymore. As we wander these stairs looking for the exit, we see literal windows into Dolores' life. In the walls around us, through windows, we see Dolores doing simple things. This represents the windows in her life that she still clings to when she hears music that was perhaps playing at the time, cradling snippets of individual memories for her, things that might have felt inconsequential in that moment, but are now all that she has left. Dolores' section of Visage is crushingly real, depressing, miserable, fantastic. Not only is her sob-worthy unraveling demonstrated both to the literal story we're told through the cassettes that we find and various context clues, but also the physical geography of the house warping around us, fading into nothing but disparate walkways and doors that open into nothing. While I don't find this to be a particularly sensitive portrayal of a person with dementia who becomes a literal horror lurking through the house and making you jump because, ooh, scary, I did find it to be a crushing portrayal of the disease itself. Man, I've made myself sad. Let's move on. Lucy's chapter is the classic Layers of Fear style oppressive horror jump scare bonanza, but it also contains some of the worst bullshit in the game, mainly because her puzzles are complex, often on a timer, and feature a very confusing, aggressive enemy AI depending on your luck. On one of my playthroughs, I had Lucy chasing me down and killing me within the first 10 seconds of every single respawn, over and over again, no matter how many sanity pills I took. On later playthroughs, I'd at least make it upstairs before Jaws here grabbed me by the pocket of my jeans, spun me around and ripped me a bigger mouth. Her chapter is the most controversial due to the deluge of jump scares it features, when the other two chapters employ them with far more restraint. Judging from complaints about Lucy's chapter, it also seems that people coming from Dolores' chapter expected a similar route of puzzle-heavy wandering, not this intense series of chases and insta-kills, and I do think there's some validity here. If it was just one or two people, I'd be like, yeah, maybe you just don't understand. But a lot of people complain about the way Lucy's chapter has you fighting for your life basically from square one, which to me tells me that there's something the game is not communicating that well. I don't think Lucy's chapter needs to be different, but I do think there could be a little bit extra exposition delivered early on to let us know that a different approach is going to be necessary, and this is the only time in the entire video I'm going to advocate for the player to be told more, too, before you assume I want this game to be dumbed down for the normies. Visage doesn't mind using cutscenes and audio cues to deliver information, but this is usually done at the end of chapters when it's less important. Perhaps we could hear audio of Lucy killing someone, or maybe a note or a bloody warning on the wall. If people miss it then that's on them. Or perhaps, since she is canonically and chronologically first, we could just be made to do her chapter first. It's far easier to go from Lucy to the rest of the game than it is to go from Rakan or Dolores to Lucy, but getting accustomed to 5 hours of quiet Dolores puzzle solving only to wind up trapped in the basement on red sanity while a ghostly 10-year-old gnaws on you is going to annoy people. Sorry. I'll talk about this in more detail later when I discuss developer logic, bad controls, and the many bugs and inconsistencies of Visage, but Lucy's chapter is very iffy on a blind playthrough. Lucy was the first person to inhabit the house only a year before Dolores, 1961. As we learn from her story, Lucy made an imaginary friend that took on a sinister appearance, some huge cloaked figure, a classic choice for 10-year-old girls' imaginary friends, who began to push her into more and more dangerous territory, talking to her through the TV and the radio in her treehouse. She kills her pet bird. Assuming that this is a worsening of schizophrenia, her parents try and fail to medicate her. You begin Lucy's chapter in her room. You have to knock a few times on the back wall of her closet, getting, to your dismay, a response despite the house being empty. From here, exploring on your own may lead you to the TV room, where you are able to see Lucy standing in a room in the basement. Naturally, you are to follow her here and see if you can find her. All good so far. The suspense is fucking reprehensible by the time you get downstairs and find that you can hear her creaking and groaning in the deep freezer room, a room that will be pitch black at this point. Daring to turn the light on, a feat that took me and my friends actual minutes, will reveal the room to be empty. Only an old-timey flash camera has spawned behind you. Visage does well to make key items very obvious. Still, the reason I've explained to you the individual steps of this chapter so far is because I want you to understand the extremely mild series of events that leads up to unleashing the most monstrous AI in this game. Picking up this camera will activate Lucy. She will appear in a short scripted event wherein she drops a syringe at her feet and disappears, but for us she started attacking so viciously afterwards that my friends and I assumed the scripted event was part of it. At this point she spawn camped us for the better part of 20 minutes. We could not walk through either corridor to exit the basement. We could not climb any of the stairs to escape. We could not hide in any of the basement rooms. We were just stuck. Confused and assuming that there was something we were doing wrong, it was at this point that we folded and pulled up a guide. And okay, it looked like we weren't doing anything wrong. A little Google search confirmed that this phenomenon occurred with some other players who miserably encouraged us to just push through. Get upstairs, trigger the next part of the chapter at any cost so that we can have a new autosave outside of the basement we were getting shagged in.
I beg your pardon?
That was the hardest part of Lucy's chapter. It settles down after this on the whole. We have a few segments of wandering the house, we have an outdoors segment in what looks like Ark Survival Evolved, culminating in a treehouse sit and wait special, and then we have another segment inside the house, except Lucy has removed every single light switch on the property and used them as breadcrumbs to lead us in our next direction. Lucy, to me, seemed far less aggressive upon a return playthrough, and I managed to get much further into the house before she started haunting me. Lucy's chapter takes us progressively further and further from the main house, through otherworldly rooms full of bird cages and random bits of furniture. I like some of the concepts Visage introduces. There's one pitch black room where Lucy is roaming amongst furniture, and you have to creep around and find the key to the opposite door, using only the light of the camera flash to guide your way. The key spawns at random inside one of the many bureaus and desks around the room, only while furniture provides a good amount of cover for you, it also stops you from being exactly sure of where Lucy is, cultivating tension so extreme that it made me sick to my stomach. Finding the key elicits the maddest, most desperate scramble back to the locked door. Awesome segment. That being said, it's followed by one of the weakest. Visage loves a good maze. All 3 chapters have one in some way or another. It's at its strongest in Dolores' chapter, who shows signs of dementia amongst a whole slew of other developing mental illnesses, so having the familiar house warp, change and echo around you makes for a great touch. As in great as in effective, obviously. And it's not great that dementia makes for riveting gameplay. It's very sad, very sad. On the other hand, I did not appreciate Lucy's maze. Towards the midpoint of her chapter, we are introduced to the entity that is stalking and possessing Lucy, some doll-faced, long-clawed monster that makes strange bear noises when it's about to spawn on top of you. We are then thrust into a maze, essentially on a timer, as it begins to chase us slowly whilst invisible. You know it's about to land on you like a bag of bricks because the bear noises get louder and louder as it gets closer, but there's nowhere to hide and you can't outrun it, so deaths often feel a bit shoulder shruggy go next, rather than the moments of backbreaking horror I feel they were intended to be. This is compounded by the maze being very trial and error. It's all one big monotonous and windy corridor. Most of the doors open onto jump scares. If you spend too long trying to figure out what to do, you're dead. You reach a gap a corgi could jump over, but Dwayne insists on needing some kind of plank bridge, but he refuses to use anything that isn't the special plank that has eyes drawn on it and you need to backtrack for. It's a massive plank that you have to carry in front of you, completely obstructing your vision, but its model also gets stuck on doorways and such, so you have to step back just to unloop the thing off the back of Lucy's gaming chair. Items you're carrying will get stuck on things, and they won't just ping around them if you pull the invisible rubber banding tight enough. You physically have to go and unstick them to be able to continue carrying them. This maze has a pause in a room that's probably the most complained about of the entire game. Scuttling out of the maze, you find yourself in a huge room full of wardrobes. As it turns out, trying to open most of the doors will either result in an empty wardrobe or a jump scare death. What you're actually supposed to do is tuck around to the right to find a hole lined with unlit candles and jump into that instead. Despite complaints, I actually didn't mind this room and I preferred it wholeheartedly to the silly trial and error maze that came before it. Setting up expectations, a big room full of wardrobes to sift through, and then subverting them with an easy solution tucked in the corner made me laugh and kind of go like, oh you. It felt like a tongue-in-cheek subversion, like some cheeky game development gnome was tinkering away with ideas and went for something that ended up being way easier than it appeared to be. Overall, Lucy's chapter has some of the most interesting imagery. The problems that plague Rakan and Dolores are plainly laid out to us, but Lucy's is the most abstract of storytelling. One thing we do know is that Lucy is unsuccessfully medicated for her mental health issues, but beyond that her situation is not made clear. What is her demon? Some suggest that it's a literal demon. This is a supernatural game, so suggestions like that aren't out of the question. Others theorize that it's an imaginary friend, or an aspect of herself that manifests to torment her and you. Some have considered that it might have represented a real person in Lucy's life that drove her to rip her own jaw off and kill herself. Perhaps the time we spend in the treehouse indicates that someone met her there and did something to her, or spoke to her through the radio. There's also the MKUltra Theory, but that one's quite toothy, so we will just cover that later. Either way, Lucy's chapter ends with a cutscene demonstrating the torment Lucy's parents faced in trying to medicate her for her mental health problems, and Lucy's own suicide by jaw rippage in the bathroom. time. Their efforts were in vain. At this point, my friends branded Visage as stupid as fuck, and after watching them have to resort to a guide just to get through a plank of wood maze, I felt compelled to agree. The fact that this game has you scouring a gigantic mansion very slowly without much guidance and then relentlessly punishing you with insta-kills and jump scares for taking your time or being lost is kind of ludicrous. It was at this point that we stopped playing and we did face masks and braided each other's hair instead. Attempt number 2 at playing Visage came to a grim end and stayed that way for a year or more. Rakan's chapter is a cutscene-heavy psychological horror taking place mostly in a hospital. It's also completely meh. Despite being the only chapter in the game with an actual boss fight, yeah, I know, right? Rakan's chapter of Visage is kind of dull. Maybe it was because it was the last one I played, I'm not sure. Either way, he lived in the house in 1970 and seems to know Dwayne personally, as he calls him out by name, accusing Dwayne of having ruined his life. On a quite cool but tangential note, Rakan's backstory is based on the story of Rakan, a high-level backer on the game's Kickstarter who shares a lot in common with Rakan himself, such as being a rugby player. Anyway, Rakan's story is extremely unique, although we see a few cutscenes at the start of his chapter within the house to indicate he feels some kind of paranoia. Almost all of his story takes place in the mental hospital he ends up being confined to after firing his gun within the house. The doctors mitigate him and try to convince him it's all in his head. Weirdly, when he fires the gun in the house, he seems to be firing at us, despite us clearly watching a flashback. Only when we turn around, it's Dwayne's personal monster that attacks Rakan, the Tar Man. I didn't love Rakan's chapter because it takes you from the house and puts you in the hospital. The hospital is just as complex a series of maps as the house, with tons of rooms and windy corridors and hidden routes, and you have to comb through it just as carefully for things like magnetic key cards and handles and whatnot, only to suddenly be thrust into an entirely new map. It becomes tiring to have to approach brand new maps constantly and sift through them in the dark for missable key items. Moreover, Rakan's chapter is very fast-paced. It's the closest thing to an action sequence we'll get in Visage. Weirdly, Visage will give you access to different max speeds depending on which part of the game you're in. I suppose it's so you don't flatten yourself against every wall in the house like Wile E. Coyote. In longer corridors you can sprint super fast, but often your max speed will be capped to everybody's gone to the rapture speed. In Rakan's chapter, however, you get max speed with no limit, and you fly through that shit at breakneck speed if you know what you're doing. Rakan's chapter features multiple scripted chases, some of them exciting and some of them annoying. One part of this chapter has you sprinting through a confusing web of corridors as faceless entities charge at you. If they touch you, you die, and they spawn infinitely, and you're not told what you're looking for, and every single door along every single corridor can be opened, and it's a maze, and every single room can be explored. So you don't know what on earth you need to be looking for, and may by chance blunder towards the end of this segment and find a door surrounded by exit signs. Oh yeah, of course, I should have known. Cool concept, honestly, but very annoying to do blind. Rakan's chapter is also the most story heavy. While I'd argue maybe 5% of Dolores' section is cutscenes, Rakan's is sitting probably at like 50%. Most of the time spent playing Rakan's section is spent watching the story unfold, which is pretty cool to understand, but felt the most frustrating to have to contend with after the other 2 chapters. I've settled in to play an extremely intricate drip-fed game. Like, the dial of my brain has been turned towards slow and self-led exploration, so it feels physically jarring to have to stop and start through a deluge of storytelling. Despite the fact that I think Rakan's chapter is perfectly fine, and I'd have really enjoyed it in any other game, I dislike its conclusion mechanically the most out of any chapter in Visage, since it just feels so different, it's hard to adjust to. I think the angle they were going for here was similar to Outlast, but Outlast is an extremely tight corridor you basically run in a direct line through until you enter the only available door. Visage still tries to be a puzzle game, so there are multiple rooms, and thus these chases can often become a trial and error mess. Rakan's story is all about his false imprisonment in a mental institute after discharging a gun at an assumed ghost in his house. Rakan is extremely paranoid and believes his house has been bugged. Because it has been bugged. Rakan's whole arc is about being watched. Rakan has scopophobia, the fear of being stared at. It is also known as ophthalmophobia. Consequently, all of his puzzles and in-game enemies revolve around that concept. Rakan's segment features a unique game mechanic wherein a black substance with eyes locks the doors. In order to unlock them, you have to locate paintings that have physical eyes on them and prod them to make the eyes disappear on the locked doors. Progress is locked off until we can walk over to these paintings, stare them in the eye, and then press said eye, something Rakan would struggle with. Not only does this make a mockery of his very oppressive phobia, but also implies that people are looking out from the paintings, which they kind of are. In the opening few cutscenes of this section, we watch events unfold through a flickering sepia TV tone, a TV tone that isn't used for any other part of the game. Rakan sitting alone and monologuing at his table isn't just done for the purpose of giving us a bit of welcome exposition for his section. It's to show us that we are literally watching him, not just physically in the moment, but we are watching a recording taken of this man sitting at his table in his pajamas. His house is actually genuinely bugged. In fact, Rakan seems to be an unfortunate aspirational whistleblower to a scheme he's not even aware the fullest extent of. The exact nature of his observers is something we'll discuss later, but more to the point, Rakan's chapter ends in the only boss fight in Visage. Dwayne faces off against a furious, murderous Rakan and a massive eyeball. Dwayne must avoid Rakan by sprinting around the room until he finds a knife and then take that knife to the eyeball. The boss fight isn't so much about killing Rakan as it is destroying the observer. Upon winning, if you could call it that, Dwayne heads down into an unknown basement. Rakan appears on the other side of a one-sided mirror as though in an interrogation room. Arguably, this confirms the fears Rakan has of being watched right from the beginning, except he's making too much noise about it to now ignore, and he is killed in front of us. Overall, Rakan's chapter was fine, but entirely overshadowed by the far better quality chapters of Lucy, Dolores, and Big Man Dwayne. I would love to have more to say about Rakan, but I really don't. Story-wise, his chapter is very straightforward. There's not much to unearth about it. Mechanically, it is the most simple. There's not much to critique. It was just fine. It was nothing special. Finally, we move on to Dwayne, who inhabited the house in 1985, 15 years after Rakan. Dwayne is our main character. He is the guy in the opening cutscene who shoots his family to death and then kills himself, and Visage is his story. I don't think it's possible to definitively explore Dwayne without making some clear conclusions on who he actually is and why exactly he's in that house and what exactly is going on, so let's do that. The simplest theory is usually the correct one, and the simplest way to understand what happened to the people of Visage is to put up our hands and recognise that every character we meet across our travels is mentally ill, and they succumb to their mental illness. Taking a cursory glance at the fandom wiki, because I forgot to write this down while I was playing, Lucy has schizophrenia at a time when treatments included metrazole shock, electroconvulsive therapy, insulin comas, and frontal leucotomies. The former two are completely ineffective cures for schizophrenia in particular, and the latter two no longer have any place whatsoever in psychiatry. She received zero effective treatment, and the condition worsened until she took her own life. Dolores had dementia, bipolar disorder, anxiety, and violent paranoia. There's not much known about her husband George, but he does leave little cassettes across the house during her chapter that we can listen to. We learn that he was aware of her mental illnesses and becomes increasingly concerned that he is not able to provide ample support. It's only when he considers sending her off for further help that she becomes paranoid about him trying to hurt her, and Dolores kills him. Dementia alone is going to be an extremely taxing and difficult condition to deal with. Compounding that with 3 other formidable mental illnesses may just have been a cocktail unfortunate enough to result in tragedy. Rakan had scopophobia and, depending on your interpretation of events, paranoia. And Dwayne, as we learn, comes freshly wrapped with alcoholism, anxiety, and depression. Dwayne's story is told to us across a series of tapes labelled Pride, Greed, Prison, Negligence, Indifference, Addiction, and Affliction. And all I can say is, thanks for not stooping to the cliche of using 7 deadly sins, says Studios. Rather, these tapes, besides Prison, which is a strange outlier, chart the web of Dwayne's own evil. In Addiction, we see a voice on the TV telling Dwayne to drink. By the time we see Negligence, Dwayne is lumping 5 crates of beer into his trolley at once and drinking them until he vomits on himself in the TV room, his wife shouting at him the entire time. It is perfectly possible to assume that this was merely a string of coincidences set in a time of limited mental illness services and support. It was probably all just a bit of bad luck in an innocent house whose property value has now probably made it quite affordable. But you have to wonder why a neighbour would call your house 3 times in a single night to express so much worry, but at first it appears as though Rose doesn't have a lot to do with herself. Sure, if Dwayne was firing off a gun or screaming the place down, then yeah, maybe call and check in, but Rose is one of those disembodied NPC voices that seems to have her own entirely individual conversation, regardless of the context you answer the phone in, and chats to you aimlessly for a while before hanging up. In fact, if we pick up the neighbour comic book pages, we learn that Rose is not who we think she is. Rose calls Dwayne 3 times across the course of the story. The first 2 times it is to feign concern. Upon picking up and reading all 4 neighbour pages, we learn that Rose had that night killed her husband in the bathtub. We even learn that she was drinking his blood whilst making the first call to Dwayne. It's easy to miss this detail considering they despawn when you pick them up, but all collected comic book pages will wind up on the desk in the boys' room, so you can go and read them when you have them all. When she makes that final call, she assures Dwayne that she will see him later. So who is she? Some have speculated that Rose was the demon haunting Lucy. Maybe she's just a neighbour who snapped under the weight of an implied few decades of domestic abuse. But if so, why would she be so gleefully sadistic at the idea of quote-unquote paying Dwayne a visit? When we consider the name Rose may not be in reference to a flower, but rather the act of rising, i.e. from the grave, we've also got stuff to consider there. Personally, I don't subscribe to the theory that Rose is the demon, but I wanted to mention it to you so that you know I've checked all of the avenues. I think that Rose has been taking mad drugs, but we'll get to that later. There is a demon though, in Visage, at least I think so, and so does Simon Franklin, a WordPress writer who has written a pretty extensive article on this topic in particular. While we see Lucy, Dolores and Rakan's deaths in their respective chapters, we also know that Dwayne killed his whole family and himself. Lewis Taylor died while living at the house, which we learned from the neighbours' comics, and Rose killed her husband. There's a lot of violent death associated with this house, so either there's something in the water, or there's something a little more involved going on. If you do any amount of digging on Visage, you'll read about Malthus, a crow demon who first appears in Johann Weyer's Pseudo-Monarchia Demonium. The clearest, but also kind of incorrect description of him can be found on Wikipedia, where they cite him as looking like a raven, whereas all of the individual sources say that he's a crow, and they're 2 different birds, but I'll just quote the Wikipedia verbatim and switch out the mention of ravens for crows. Johann Weyer's book, written in 1577, contains a list of demons alongside the appropriate hours and rituals to conjure them. Malthus is cool. He appears as a crow, but if requested will resemble a man with a hoarse voice. Somewhere along the line, he began to be portrayed in the media with blue eyes so bright that they'd stand out even when he himself is draped in shadow. This is how he's portrayed in many shows and games he features in, but weirdly, it seems to be consistent across all implementations. It came from somewhere, I just can't find where. Either way, we see his bright blue eyes when he appears on the television, despite him wearing a mask. According to his associated Wikipedia page, Malthus is said to build houses, high towers and strongholds, throw down the buildings of enemies, destroy enemies' desires or thoughts, and or make them known to the conjurer. According to the writers, Malthus accepts willingly and kindly any sacrifice offered to him, and then he will allegedly deceive the conjurer. So when we play the Greed VHS tape and we come to a desk in a big plush office, we find a contract to sign. The contract is titled Special Contract, and written on that contract in bright red ink is the message, "You don't give a fuck." What's sat on the head of the chair behind the contract watching you sign? That's right, a crow. Chronology-wise, I believe the events taking place in the Greed VHS tape are the earliest in Dwayne's personal story. At some point in his life, say 30 years prior, swayed by immense greed, Dwayne signed a contract that required him to turn a blind eye to the death and suffering of many, many people. And unfortunately for him, he unknowingly signed that contract with Malthus. Malthus accepted willingly and kindly the sacrifices Dwayne offered him and then deceived him. In another tape, we see Dwayne taking an apple from a tree, watching it rot before dropping it into a big black well. After this point, bodies bubble to the surface, a direct visual metaphor for the consequences of Dwayne's indulgence in sin. Malthus destroys the desires and thoughts of enemies. It manipulates Lucy into killing her bird and then herself. It exacerbates Dolores' conditions. It especially toys with Rakan. But more than anyone, we see Malthus toy with Dwayne. As mentioned, if not appearing as a crow, he appears as a man with a hoarse voice, and in most of the VHS tapes we meet the masked man, an unknown entity wearing a plague doctor's mask resembling a crow who speaks to him. He pushes Dwayne to start drinking in the addiction tape. In one of the tapes he convinces Dwayne that his wife only wants his money and wants Dwayne to die. He pushes Dwayne to kill his own family, a sacrifice he accepts willingly, and then deceives Dwayne by trapping him in the house with his own sins. You even speak to him in a tower at one point, the crow demon that builds homes and towers, in a strange hellish place some people have theorized as the river Styx itself, dotted with the catatonic dregs of other lost souls claimed by Malthus. But what if Malthus is said to build houses? Malthus got the brick and mortar set up for this place? Did he pick out the curtains? In a sense, no, but in another sense, maybe. Give me 5, I'll come back to it. But so far, I believe both interpretations wholeheartedly. Yes, I believe that every inhabitant of the house suffered from some kind of mental illness, and I believe every inhabitant had their mental illness preyed upon and exacerbated by the malice of Malthus himself. Lucy ripped her own jaw off in the bathroom, that was her, but the door unlocks from the inside at her exact moment of death. Not by Lucy, so by who? Malthus took the form of Lucy's imaginary friend and worsened her schizophrenia. Malthus potentially fed the paranoid delusions of a dementia-ridden Dolores, fanning the flames of her bipolar disorder. And then it toyed with Rakan, who felt like he was being watched. Remember, we see in Rakan's introductory cutscene that he sees the ghost of Lewis Taylor, the man who died in the house the year before he moved in. We know Lewis is real, and we watched Lewis attack Rakan. Add to that a heaping pile of LSD and wait, what? During the Holocaust, some inmates at Auschwitz and Dachau became human subjects for experimentation under the Nazi scientists during World War II. The quote-unquote undesirables of the Nazi regime suffered on the receiving end of barbiturates, morphine, hallucinogens, to name a few. The intention here was to develop a truth serum to, quoting Dachau scientist Kurt Plotner, eliminate the will of the person examined. When the war ended, America adopted much of that Nazi research and some of those Nazis in Project Paperclip, a top-secret intelligence program intended to harness Nazi brainpower in the Cold War directives. American historian Stephen Kinzer argued that this Nazi research and many of those Nazis lived on in Project MKUltra. Adopting Holocaust research and applying it to the noble people of America? What could go wrong? A lot, actually. Project MKUltra was a highly illegal, gross, and real program undertaken by the CIA spanning the years 1953 to 1973. During these years, the CIA engaged in vile human experimentation with the end goal of essentially seeing how best they could brainwash and psychologically torture people. They did this with high doses of psychoactive drugs, especially LSD, but also employed electroshocks, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and sexual abuse, and flat-out torture alongside it, just to see what subjects would do. This was not done with the subject's consent, and often the CIA would take advantage of those who may be too scared to speak out for fear of their reputation being ruined, such as the repulsively named Operation Midnight Climax, which specifically targeted men in San Francisco who visited brothels. These men were heavily drugged and then had their sexual interactions recorded and studied, knowing that they would be too scared to speak up about it. The deluge of abuse by MKUltra affected public places like colleges, universities, and military organisations, but branched out to ensure that the government were also targeting the most vulnerable members of society: prisons, hospitals, institutions, clinics, and pharmaceutical companies, specifically targeting people who could not physically leave their confinement and or relied completely on their spiked treatment. Even if they got a whiff of what was happening to them, what were they going to do? So, hands up, where does Dwayne work? Health pharmaceuticals. When did the deaths in the Visage house occur? Between 1961 and 1970. Why do Dolores and Rakan know Dwayne by name? Because he sold them their treatment. The more we uncover, the more we learn that the CIA ran absolutely rampant in the neighbourhood in which Visage is set, with Dwayne at the helm. Dwayne is a doctor. He is the doctor who treated Rakan and Dolores at the very least. They know him by name, and Rakan accuses Dwayne of ruining his life, and he may also have treated Lucy. Having signed his contract with the devil, or as close to him as you can get in an instance like this, Dwayne forgoes the health and safety of innumerable people for enough cash to buy the mansion he willingly facilitates the medical abuse and murders. Malthus, the demon who builds houses and towers, may not have built this particular home, but I would wager that the CIA did. As we learn from Rakan, the house is monitored and abused. It wouldn't be a stretch to assume the home had been built for the sake of facilitating grisly research, or kitted out to monitor the fallout of it. Where the CIA performed acts of true, unspeakable and hellish evil, Malthus clearly followed, either hand in hand, inadvertently or otherwise, or Malthus saw what they were doing and decided that he wanted a piece of the pie. Lucy, Dolores and Rakan all receive treatment from health pharmaceuticals. Explicitly, Lucy drops a syringe for you in the basement that you can pick up. One of Dolores' puzzles involves you fitting an IV onto a burned shadow of her on a hospital bed, and Rakan spends most of his time sedated and medicated in the local asylum he is unfairly assigned to. According to the 1979 book The Search for the Manchurian Candidate by John Marks, amphetamine would have been administered by IV, but experiments would also have included heroin, morphine, diazepam under the codename MK Search, mescaline, psilocybin, scopolamine, alcohol, and sodium pentothal. Methamphetamine was also injected by syringe. Although the VHS tapes do feature some locations that are clearly based on actual scenes from Dwayne's life, many moments are heavily allegorical. Huge expanses of darkness with a single well sat in the middle do not usually lie at the center of water treatment plants. Dwayne did not actually feature on a talk show with Malthus himself. Rooms are not always made of sheets of paper that flutter and scream around your face. Supermarkets do not scroll on infinitely until you've realized you're supposed to put 5 crates of beers in your trolley. These VHS tapes are intended to be picked apart and analysed. When we see Dwayne toss a rotten red apple into the water in one of his VHS tapes, bodies rise to the top, indicating the consequence of tainting the water with something. What might that have meant? Well, when we read the Neighbours comics, we see Rose repeatedly drinking glasses of water, very explicitly, like many of the frames focus on it, and then she snaps and murders her husband. Perhaps prolonged exposure to these drugs in the water eventually led to hallucinations and psychosis. Dolores drinks her sleepy time tea, her favourite. Lucy's story sees a heavy focus on her taking a lot of baths. Rakan is literally drinking a glass of water right in the start of his chapter, just before he sees the ghost that attacks him. Visage takes a lot of care to centre many scenes around water. Our 3 characters also all receive communications from what is assumed to be the demon through modern devices. Dolores hears whisperings on the baby monitor, Lucy says her imaginary friend speaks to her through the TV, and Rakan hears through the radio. Dwayne is manipulated by Malthus through the TV. He hears demonic talking through the radio during the prison VHS. The radio in the house frequently turns on and majorly drains sanity. Lucy is told to kill her bird Pico by the voice in the radio. Is the demon trying to manifest her evil, or is a handler trying to understand how much her will has been affected by the experimental drugs? The name of our first chronological antagonist, Lucy, may even be referenced to the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which is often abbreviated to LSD. Now, John Lennon was pretty clear that this song was not about LSD. Just to be clear, some of their songs were about LSD, and he was like, yes, these are about LSD. He said that Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is not about LSD, but it's still a rumour that many people have come to assume is true about the song. Lucy may well still be a reference to the drug that likely would have been administered to her during her quote-unquote treatment. So, Lewis Taylor, a name I've mentioned a few times. Let's talk about him. Lewis Taylor is so overwhelmingly considered to be an entity called the Tar Man by the Visage player base that I was surprised to see him listed as Tar Man on the fandom wiki and not just Lewis. Lewis Taylor was a local worker at the water treatment plant and the inhabitant of the house 1 year prior to Rakan's arrival, as we learn from Rose in the comics. She remarks that he looks sad. Today, Lewis Taylor is dead. Tar Man is an entity covered in black tar. He's visible across the game in subtle moments, implying his link to the 3 victims in little ways. He appears briefly in Rakan's chapter when attacking Rakan and when pointing Dwayne in the correct direction during a rush through the hospital, but his main appearances occur outside of chapters in the house, notably during the VHS tapes. As I learned, you don't need to have a VHS tape active for Tar Man to hunt you. I was doing some wandering after finishing the game, wondering what all the splodges of black tar were on the ceiling, when suddenly I got grabbed by a slippery fellow and killed. Whoopsie. Tar Man is covered in the same black tar we find in a few notable places. It's in the well that Dwayne drops an apple into. It seems to be the substance he rose over to reach the Tower of Malthus, and most importantly, it fills Lewis Taylor's locker, and only Lewis Taylor's locker. Let's be real. I think Lewis Taylor is the Tar Man. This isn't a fan theory that I'm interested in debating. You see, Dwayne seems to be treating individuals for mental illnesses that he then sabotages as part of the MKUltra program, but it's also heavily implied that the CIA extended the project to begin lacing the water supply for the neighbourhood with some kind of drug, and the rest is history. However, when we go to drop the apple in the well, we need a keycard to enter the facility. Dwayne doesn't work here, so he doesn't have one. Instead, we go to the locker of Lewis Taylor, drenched in goo, and we fetch the keycard, and then we embark on our mission of cruel negligence and evil sabotage. For whatever reason, Lewis is Dwayne's way into the water treatment facility. Maybe he pays him off. Hence, the tar suddenly comes alive with meaning. The black, oily water represents the way that Dwayne has irreversibly destroyed the local water supply and the local ecosystem. Oil kills local wildlife and can prevent the growth of new vegetation, kind of like what the CIA is doing to Dwayne's neighbourhood. Moreover, the black tar represents the guilt felt by Dwayne and Lewis and their guilty complicity. Lewis's hands are dirtied by Dwayne's sins and by extension his soul. Lewis's locker is the only one full of this filth, indicating his feelings of guilt and isolation amongst his peers. At some point, Lewis died. Some people believe Lewis killed himself as a result of the guilt, but I personally think that he came to Dwayne and told him that he wanted to come clean, and Dwayne killed him, potentially by drowning him, hence his being covered in the black oily water. An ironic act for Dwayne, especially considering he has an actual confession booth inside the chapel built within his own home. Lewis's tar-soaked visage, roll credits, represents the fact that Dwayne had made him dirty. Dwayne has made him complicit. There's blood on his hands and Dwayne is washing him in it. It also represents a baptism of sorts. Assuming Dwayne drowns Lewis, Lewis is reborn again, returning to haunt him. Lewis's grudge is apparent, resenting Dwayne for what he made him do and preventing him from getting a chance to set things right. Lewis might not be at peace, sure, but he's a good sight better than that of Dwayne. So, Dwayne is dead. He is dead. In my opinion, the House of Visage is his purgatory. Dwayne is trapped in this limbo, forced to understand the pain and grief he has caused others and to help their spirits rest before he can even begin to make peace with his own. Hence why he only earns access to his VHS tapes after suffering through the misery he put onto others in their respective chapters. At the start of the game, we see Dwayne shoot his family and then himself. This is likely due to the manipulation of Malphus, who pushed him over the edge into his alcoholism and then fed him lies that his wife planned to kill him. We don't know much about Dwayne's wife in reality. She might have been very supportive, but Dwayne kills her and the kids anyway. However, as an echo to PT, Dwayne wakes up in an empty concrete room. Every time he dies, he wakes up there again, and another tally mark is scratched into the floor, with a maximum of 6 per new game. You see, the bodies of his family might be gone, but his gun is not. Upon obtaining the sledgehammer in the Dolores chapter, you can take it down to the basement where a recently replastered wall is waiting. You can smash the wall to pieces and climb down another set of stairs, down towards Dwayne's personal hell, the empty room with a table and a gun, and you can try to shoot yourself again. Doing this will merely reset the house and may spawn you some lighters, to be fair, but Dwayne has a limited number of bullets in the chamber. Dwayne gets 6 chances. If after using every bullet in the gun you go downstairs and try to kill yourself again, Dwayne will wake up at the bottom of an impossible well in an expanse that stretches on in every single direction, and he is left to wander there forever until the credits roll. I believe this is Dwayne failing his chances to reconcile with his sins in life and escape purgatory. I believe that this is Dwayne winding up in hell, where he may suffer forevermore. If Dwayne takes the time to sift through each VHS tape, completing each individual task and constructing a silver mask, he will put it on. Sunlight will stream in through the windows of the house. Dwayne will head downstairs to the gun room. Opening the door will reveal his family waiting for him in a room full of glowing white light. The credits roll over a still shot of lush forests and mountains. I assume his heaven. Considering all the theories of Visage, I think it's a little bit of all of them, and it's just up to you how you weigh them. I don't think this is just mental illness. This is no What Remains of Edith Finch. I don't think this is just experimentation, nor just demons and purgatory. I absolutely believe that every one of them combined has a part to play. How much you choose to attribute to each is up to you. Like, I think it's like 50% MKUltra, 40% mental health, 10% demons did it, but you might feel differently. The story of Visage is so complex and in some parts truly beautiful. Its examinations of the evil of humanity intermingle with the implications of demonic interference. How much does Malphus even need to try when Dwayne will happily kill hundreds of people off the back of his own greed? How active do demons even need to be when evil is lurking in the most monotonous corners of daily life? Critics and players alike applaud Visage for its exceptional story and intriguing methods of storytelling. As a story, it's impeccable. As a game, when we're designing something, be it a physical item like a car or a piece of software, it is essential that user experience be considered right from the beginning. Before you even make your map or your gameplay loop or your story, you have to put your player character into a basic room and have some users test out the control scheme to see if it makes any sense to them. If it doesn't, you need to iterate until it does. If you ignore their feedback, it doesn't mean that problems magically go away. Users will still dislike it upon release, except now you'll have a choice to make. Spend immense time and effort to fix it and release a patch, pulling apart your game to repair the skeleton, or leave it as it is. And many developers just choose to leave it, instead taking on feedback for their next project. When you build your first puzzles, you need to get your users in the room again, using the refined, intuitive control scheme that makes sense to them, with a HUD that delivers exactly the information a user may need at a particular moment, not what they want, what they need and know before you say it. I don't mean a clustered HUD with loads of information. Put the users in a room room with a complete puzzle and see how they solve it. Then do this for every puzzle. Here you can understand things we call bottlenecks, moments of the gameplay loop that users get stuck at. Don't get me wrong, this isn't a part of the game that's hard, this isn't a difficulty situation. There will be bottlenecks that are natural when the gameplay ramps up. This is a communication situation. It's not about making it easier, it's about being absolutely sure that a user has been given the tools they need to be able to solve a puzzle, and if they don't, it's about making sure they have them. Visage varies on the consistency of its communication, and that can be an issue. Sometimes you are given the information you need in advance, be it 5 minutes ago or 50 minutes ago, and that's fair game, but sometimes you aren't. If this was always the case, more people would stick it out with this game, I feel, but if 25% of the puzzles have solutions completely pulled out of thin air, or even occasionally contradicting previously established rules or facts, users subconsciously lose trust in the game. When a user doesn't trust a game, they are less likely to stick through it, they're more likely to just jump to using guides because they don't feel like it's worth trying different solutions that the game might just wave away. They're more likely to consider solutions bullshit and unfair. When a user knows that they will be rewarded for fastidious effort and thinking, they will put that effort in. Now, Visage contains a lot of examples of strange solutions we could look at to illustrate this point. Let's look at a puzzle example that I liked, the glass ball. A lot of people complain about this puzzle, but I quite liked it. I didn't love it, but I liked it. During the Dolores chapter, we walk into a huge meaty room and a suspended fetus gives us a glass ball with an item we need inside of it. Stay with me here. Now we need to figure out how to get this out. So where in the chapter have we come from already? Where might we have found some tools that can fix this problem? Well, we've just come from the garage, so let's check there. Retracing our steps, which is expected since the fetus room doesn't lead anywhere, we return to the garage and find a vice right in the center of the room on a table that is lit by an overhead light. The vice is, and always was, something we could interact with. When we were personally in this garage, we took one look at Dolores waiting for us at the top of the stairs and spent about 35 minutes puttering around trying to find something else to do so that we wouldn't have to face her. I spun the stuffing out of that vice multiple times. It was well established in my memory as a standout feature of the room and one of the few things you could interact with. Moreover, when we receive the ball, we find that interacting with it in our inventory suggests that there might be something to break it with. We take the ball to the vice, interact with the vice to open it, interact with the vice to place the ball, and then interact with the vice to close it, and boom, we get the item inside. And okay, this isn't perfect. For one, it's a glass ball. Can I not just throw it at a wall? For two, we are given a sledgehammer in that very garage. Why can I not just use the sledgehammer? This example demonstrates the game's strengths and its limitations, honestly. Visage provides us with a very telegraphed, clear solution to a puzzle, the vice. However, it buries that solution under a pile of alternative, honestly perfectly serviceable solutions that merely do not work because the developers have not accounted for them. I don't think there's anything wrong with having multiple solutions to the same puzzle, since it rewards multiple schools of thought. Some people just think differently to other people. We don't have to account for 20 approaches, but getting users in and understanding the top 3 ways they'd approach some of the more obtuse puzzles might provide a few different approaches to facilitate, rather than assuming that everyone will think to use the vice. And I did use the vice, so this isn't coming from a place of personal salt. Giving a user a sledgehammer but not allowing them to break a glass ball with it is frustrating for the user because they can see a solution but are kept at arm's reach, punished essentially for not thinking the same way as the developer. You could give them the sledgehammer later, for example, wipe the option off the table in the meantime. Maybe the mirror through which we find that baby could just shatter on its own, delivering a terrifying jump scare whilst also demonstrating to us that every newly spawned mirror in the house has a room on the other side of it, encouraging exploration. We see a similar instance in the same chapter where dust falling from the ceiling draws our attention to an attic hatch we need to climb up through. Attempting to open this hatch results in an on-screen hint that suggests the hatch is too high to reach. Okay, so me and many others apparently immediately went to the master bedroom and grabbed the stool off the floor, carrying it to the attic hatch. You place it on the ground, but your player character won't stand on it. But this game is also kind of fiddly, so maybe you're just putting it at the wrong angle or not triggering it in the right way, or maybe you need to be holding the stool while you interact with the attic hatch. Why is it not working? Well, the actual solution to this puzzle is to walk downstairs towards a shadowy figure who is waiting for you at the bottom. A shadowy figure I assumed would actually kill me if I got close. I thought he was one of the random scares. Upon getting close to him, he walks off. Rounding the corner, you see him again. He walks you all the way to the opposite side of the house to a room called the progress room. Stepping inside and following the room around to the left, we find a painting of Dolores and her husband on the wall, and someone has jammed the attic hatch pole thingy into the husband's face. And you fetch that, and then you can open the attic. The attic hatch pole has no purpose beyond this. Not only is there a problem here of developer logic versus user logic, a mere we think differently situation that could have been accounted for with earlier testing, but there's also an issue of inconsistency that crops up. Visage has many moments where mechanics are created for the purpose of solving one specific puzzle and then dropped entirely. Later on in the game, during the VHS tape story sequences, we are able to pick up a stool and use it to climb into a vent in the basement. Dwayne picks up the stool and carries it like any other item, and once he gets to the vent, he automatically places and climbs it. This is the one and only instance in the entirety of Visage where a stool, or indeed any carryable furniture, can be climbed on. To see that this is accounted for in some situations, but is not an option in other situations, is inconsistent. When we are playing a game that requires us to think in an idiosyncratic way, it is surely basic politeness to ensure we are operating on a consistent set of rules. When exploring the house, we find a red storage bin that can be moved. Pressing R2 on this will move it aside, revealing a hole in the wall that Dwayne can crawl through. R2 is how we open doors and appliances and interact with everything in Visage. However, in Rakan's chapter, we enter a room with a table in front of the door. Approaching the table will show no such R2 prompt. Instead, we are supposed to walk into the table and push it out of the way of the door that way. Later in the chapter, we do the same thing with a cupboard covering a wall. Visage goes to great lengths to establish a control scheme that has us pressing R2 to move things aside, but in 2 instances, and only 2 instances, this control scheme absconds and we are left to bump around the room until something moves. Why is the cafeteria table moving that weightlessly? Realizing that the table could move, but only if we walked against it like a stranded Skyrim NPC, is cheap. It causes bitter annoyance, it makes the player feel stupid, and it frustrates them. During another VHS tape, we find that holding an item in one hand and pushing it into a window will cause the window to shatter. Every single other window in this 15-hour game is completely invulnerable. This is the only breakable window in the entire game. With the previous expectations established that windows are an unbreakable bit of set dressing in Visage, it is entirely reasonable for a user to be stood there like a lemon as the alarms go off around them, wondering how they're supposed to get into the next room. In an interview with Nathan Birch from WCCF Tech, Nathan asked developer Sad Studios, Visage spent quite a long time, over 2 years, in early access. What lessons were learned during that time, and how have they been applied to the final game? Sad Studios responded. At first we saw Visage as a game experience where the player is fully self-driven towards the next objective with absolutely no directions whatsoever. Well, this was an issue that we learned from personal friends who played it, and also from streamers, when we initially launched the game in its early access phase. People were simply getting lost and didn't know what to do. So we took a step back and changed the way the game was introduced by forcing the player in a controlled environment and then giving them objectives that were more obvious at the start of the game, instead of throwing them into a complete void of nothing but questions. We also learned there's a limit to a player's patience. We went a bit overboard with our own expectations of our game, and it added a ton of work, which ultimately caused us more bad than good. From this statement, we can infer that users were introduced to Visage very late in the development cycle. Although the aforementioned personal friends may have gotten some very, very early access into the game, it appears that most user research came from streamers who were playing the game when it was launched as a complete game in early access, i.e. control scheme, player character, map layout, mechanics, and stories had been created with not a single word of input from users. Creating a self-driven game is difficult but doable. I would consider Outer Wilds to be almost entirely self-driven, and that is one of the best games I have ever played, and legitimately I cry like a baby when I listen to the OST. Giving a player a small set of tools and an entire galaxy to explore is not impossible with the proper prep and implementation. In their answer to the interview question, Sad Studios attributes this to people getting lost and not knowing what to do. Set loose in the house, the developers were dismayed. Instead of seeing curiosity manifest, users became increasingly frustrated with a lack of direction. It was at this point in development that they decided to iterate on their design. Except this late in development, reworking a basic mechanic is going to have huge domino effects on most of the game. To exhume the foundations of Visage and tinker with them would be very likely going back to basics. So the developers of Visage did what they could, but ultimately they did what a lot of developers do when a game is basically ready but they've realised that it in its current form is a bastion of player alienation and everyone is getting really pissed off in the process of merely trying to interface with it. They applied Game design band-aids. Game design band-aids are horrendous. I hate them. When I play Uncharted, I love the action scenes and the puzzle scenes. I hate when I walk into a puzzle room and before I've even sniffed the air, Nathan Drake goes, "Wow, look at this big puzzle. I wonder if my notebook has any answers." And the big "press this button to see the notebook" prompt flashes on screen. And then you click the notebook button, the slurp button, and Nathan Drake opens his notebook and it opens on the exact page you need to read to understand the puzzle. And it has a one-to-one drawing of the puzzle with arrows and notes explaining how to solve the puzzle, and then you solve the puzzle. I saw a lot of people complaining about the recent God of War Ragnarok because companion characters would just shout the answers to things over and over again while you're doing them. A feature that could be toggled to happen less, but could not be turned off altogether. These, to me, are game design band-aids. You know, we've gone to test the segment, we've realised that users have no idea what to do, so instead of reworking it, we are going to include visual and verbal direct instructions for solving it, sucking the challenge and reward out in the process. It's whatever. In Visage, it's rampant. Hints of varying usefulness crop up on screen all the time. Sometimes you'll do something and Dwayne will automatically turn and look at the new change in the environment, forcing you to do one big lingering stare at a minor change in the room so you know for sure what to look at next. Often, context clues will be insufficient and you'll just cycle through the items you have to see what might trigger the next big change. None of these band-aids fix the foundational issues with the game's inventory management, developer logic, or mechanical communication. And to be clear, I think that Visage could have been an excellent self-driven horror game. However, you need to understand how your users are going to approach something, and you need to integrate that into the design from day one, building around it, not present it to them when it's finished. It only takes a cursory glance at the Visage subreddit and Visage's associated Steam forums to get a feel for how waiting so long to introduce users to the game cost them so much in regards to user enjoyment and retention. Many users reported uninstalling the game out of sheer frustration. Most of the remaining users commend the game on its horror, but admit that they used a guide at least once while playing the game through. Some users didn't need a guide at all, which is valid, and I do completely believe them, but I also imagine that it could be either that the individual's thought processes and approach to puzzles just so happen to align with the developer's own logic, or, you know, maybe they think the same way, or maybe they just shoved against Visage and out of pure stubbornness and until it spat them out the other end. Because without a guide, you will be doing a lot of shoving in Visage. There's this immense friction in Visage that isn't caused by one thing in particular. It's a combination of things that compound on one another to create an experience that many people are frustrated by. I will give it to the Visage enjoyers that yes, many people just do not pay close enough attention to the house. If you walk around and look at everything, you will find something to push a scene forward. Just like in PT, where looking at everything in the corridor and trying to use whatever you find will push the story along, looking at everything in the big house of Visage will give you something to do. It just takes 15 minutes to an hour longer, and in some cases has you dying and respawning so much that it becomes an exercise in trial and error. That being said, the inventory is like pulling teeth. I see red, it's ridiculous. I love a limited inventory in a horror game, so I'm not whatsoever complaining about only having 5 slots for pills, lighters, and usable quest items, but rather trying to use them is such a pain in the arse. It wasn't until my 5th playthrough, my second full playthrough, that I finally felt like I was getting the hang of this. Picking up, moving, and using items relies a ton on fucking around with the L2, R2 buttons. It's fine to use things with L2 and R2, but you have to combine a bunch of inputs to either examine and drop items, which is unintuitive. Swapping items requires holding the triangle button, and it's all just a bit awkward. Only on my second playthrough did I even begin to feel like I understood how any of this worked. The inventory system is a little unusual, which I don't mind. There's a dynamic inventory, basically 5 slots for candles, lighters, pills, and any immediate puzzle items you'd like to use, and an inventory for key items, which is much bigger. The sledgehammer and crowbar can't be stored, which is fair enough. Hovering over items was a pain in the arse most times. The reticule is finicky, most items are small, like keys and light bulbs, and you're almost always in pitch darkness, which makes things frustrating. What's more is the terrible tutorial implementation. The game does a bad job of explaining these weird and awkward controls to you, front-loading most tutorials to pop-ups that occur during the first segment of the game with a ton of accompanying text. It's overloaded and it stops and starts, and you forget it by the time you actually need to know. Using keys and stuff to open doors was incredibly awkward. You have to click on the door, then open the menu, then scroll down to the corresponding key to open it. No items have any text to indicate what they are. The tapes are all named, so Dwayne can see what they're called, but you need to examine them individually to read which one it is for yourself, at which point the game will put the tape back in at the bottom of the inventory, same for keys. I've got no idea what the intent here was, maybe to add an extra layer of fumbling and stress to the game. It came off as annoying and poorly thought out. Like, I don't mind not knowing how much lighter fluid is left, for example. That's realistic, and it gives you a feeling of uncertainty because Dwayne wouldn't know either. Do you use more of the lighter fluid to try and find more lighters, or do you push on with what you have? That's great. But if the VHS tapes and keys have names written on them, just show me the names in the inventory without me having to examine them. I think the controls could have been cleaned up so much better, and I initially did draft a portion of this video where I was going to show how I would approach rejigging the controls, but it was difficult to write it out in a way that wasn't just like a bunch of button names and random terms for controller mechanics, so even with a cleanup of the controls, Visage is a tricky customer. Visage has one major limiter. Unlike PT, Visage doesn't take place in a single L-shaped corridor. Visage takes place in a frankly ludicrous, sprawling mansion with at least 21 actual rooms. And I say actual because the twisting web of corridors between them often include little hubs that may as well be rooms in and of themselves. This is not including all of the external parts of the game we are taken to as we progress one of the 4 stories: graveyards, hospitals, water treatment plants, etc., which all have their own web of intricate internal models and interactions that can be difficult to sit through and unearth. Making a single change to the house and then carefully combing through it to see which new items and interactions have spawned can become an exhausting endeavour on a 7th comb over, especially when an interaction may be otherwise obscure or invisible, such as needing to knock on the back wall of a closet or interact with an open grave that is quite easy to miss due to it being an open hole in the ground covered in rotten leaves, visually identical to all of the other ground nearby. The second major limiter. This is a horror game with aggressive, murderous, and occasionally quite buggy AI. Sometimes you'll play a segment of the game and the roaming ghost will chain kill you. On my first attempt through Visage, my friends and I embarked on Lucy's chapter. As I mentioned, every single time we tried to go upstairs via any route, Lucy would appear and insta-kill us. In her first scripted appearance, she drops a syringe for you that you pick up. For a long time, I assumed that she immediately started haunting after this because she killed us off the back of this pickup many times. Our sanity was fine, we had a lighter. No matter which direction we went, she would kill us instantly to the point where we assumed we were doing something wrong. When I replayed, she was completely passive and I never saw her during this segment, and I realised that I just had bad luck with her AI. A cursory Google search showed that this was the case for a few other people. When I was doing the VHS tapes, after getting the Void ending, I was killed every few minutes by Lewis Taylor, an oily man who stalks you through the house even outside of chapters. He spawned randomly and killed me immediately, over and over again. I had to use a guide here just so I could make progress fast enough that the game would autosave and I'd keep progress between deaths. Visage combines a house that needs to be thoroughly combed through repeatedly, looking for minor changes in the environment for clues as to your next step, with an inconsistent enemy AI that sometimes couldn't care less that you're in the house and sometimes spawn camps you. Our third limiter. You are punished for spending too long looking around the house. Off the back of that enemy AI issue, we have the extremely controversial implementation of a sanity mechanic. As with everything in Visage, this mechanic could be so much better if it was better communicated. When the game begins, we are essentially told that standing in the dark or seeing supernatural events would cause our sanity to decrease, and that the more our sanity decreased, the more susceptible we were to being killed by roaming enemies. That's fine, it's cool, and it makes sense to me. The problem is in the implementation. The only indication we have of our sanity is a picture of a brain in the bottom left of the screen. The more shit we see, the redder it gets, until it's like a big splotch of ketchup. The problem is that the brain goes from white to pink to red in the span of a couple of seconds. It's as red as a blood clot the second you step into any kind of shadow. I think you probably get about 5 seconds or so before it's the reddest it will be, and that was all I really knew. In my opening few hours of playing Visage, this made me struggle to understand where I could go, where I could explore now, and where I maybe needed to return to later. When faced with the pitch black ocean of the basement stairs, my sanity meter would flare to max and I'd retreat, assuming maybe that I needed a proper light source later on, a flashlight or something. After a while, I would try to dart into the darkness to find a light switch to turn on, but be dissuaded by the flare-up of my sanity meter and scramble back. Oftentimes in modern games, we see mechanics that are allegedly intended to dissuade exploration until a later point. In Dark Souls, for example, you land in Firelink Shrine and you can basically go upwards into Undeadburg or down through the graveyard into the catacombs. Only the skeletons in the graveyard and the catacombs will respawn infinitely. They cannot be killed yet, and so they mob you and they'll usually kill a new player. Although a seasoned player can just kind of run past this because they know what they're doing, many Dark Souls fans will tell you that this is intended to suggest that you should come back to this area later when you're stronger. The Witcher games also have this, where enemies will be leveled depending on where they are, not scaled based off your level. So you might run into an area with like level 40 enemies, but they'll have like skulls over their heads so that you can tell that they are very strong and maybe you should come back later. This kind of "you are not good enough to be here" hostile design is often okay, but the lessons taught by it aren't in a vacuum. They tend to bleed over into other games. I didn't know, and I didn't want to Google and check in case I saw spoilers, whether the basement being a pitch impenetrable black was a subtle sign to piss off and come back with something a little more heavy duty to light my way, you know? And I struggled to find that direction. This isn't necessarily a fault of the developers or of Visage itself, but I think it's something to take into account when you're making a game for a modern audience. Although initially I was scared of the dark of the basement, eventually I ended up frustrated and trying to understand what exactly I needed to do to avoid a failure state. I'm not even sure if that early in the game I could have died in the basement. I appreciate that the developers probably wanted to introduce a feeling of insecurity, you know, even in fresh players, this risk and reward feeling of exploring the house, but early on I feel as though it mechanically discourages you from exploration, even if you're not necessarily scared, you know? Wanting to make progress and being unsure as to whether what I'm about to do is going to hinder that process isn't so much a horror game mechanic as it is just a game mechanic. Personally, I would have introduced the sanity meter when roaming ghosts first begin to hunt, and then keep it as a mechanic for the rest of the game. Giving a player a "whoops, we can't go back now" kind of moment of having lost your safety net, as though making progress has now put you in permanent danger, would be very effective. You know, let them figure shit out for 20 minutes without wondering if going down a flight of stairs is going to insta-kill them. Fourth, the game is extremely buggy, even 4 years after release. Visage is kinda broken. I played the PS5 port of Visage and it's absurdly fucked. I wimped out 10 minutes into my first attempt, died constantly to Lucy on my second attempt, to the point where I assume her AI was broken or something, and on my third attempt I had no lighters spawn in the house whatsoever. Yes, no lighters. Lighters are a fundamental part of your toolkit in Visage. There are loads of places in the game that they might spawn: on tabletops, I assume in drawers, although I never found one, and on shelves. On my third attempt at playing this game, I scoured the house for close to an hour for a lighter that I could use, and there was not a single one in a single available spawn. I assume that there are several places where they can spawn, but there's nothing in the code to assure that at least one spawns, maybe. So if you're super unlucky like me, and a couple of other people I encountered when Googling the problem, you can search for a long time and realise that you have accidentally spawned into a version of the house without lighters. And no, you can't really play the game without them on account of the aforementioned sanity mechanics, so I had to start my playthrough again from scratch. My fourth playthrough, my actual full first playthrough, hallelujah, was pretty bug-free, and there were a good plenty of lighters littered across the map, but the fifth playthrough fell apart at the seams. After I finished Dolores' chapter, there was just an invisible wall in front of the master bedroom door. If I wanted to access the outside, I had to go through Lucy's room every single time. Lighters, when equipped, would vanish from my hands, but the flame would just float stationary in the air, unmoving. It happened with every lighter I tried to use until I loaded an autosave, and then my autosaves broke. Whilst doing the VHS tapes at the end of the game, Visage began to notify me every couple of minutes that the autosave function had broken, and it had. It did not tell me why. I then died during one of the tapes and it put me back 15 minutes. Why don't you just make manual saves, Kirsty? You ask, and I say, because to stop you from soft-locking yourself, the game won't allow you to make manual saves during segments of the game where an enemy might kill you, so I couldn't. But they also gave me 6 save slots. Look, if I override all of those whilst saving my game at the moment of my death, that's on me, Visage. Let me save whenever, or fix your autosaves. I had to reload a save due to a game-breaking bug at least once per hour, I'd wager. Like I said, my fourth playthrough was seamless and issue-free, but my fifth playthrough fell apart like a house of cards. And finally, the game is just inconsistent with its mechanics. We've discussed this, so I won't explain it again here. Just compound it with the multiple huge maps, an aggressive enemy AI, an obtuse sanity mechanic, and a game prone to a ludicrous amount of bugs, and you have a game that is fundamentally resistant to you engaging with it on any kind of basic level. So, is Visage good? Mostly. I like it and respect it, but like I said, I think it's a game with a lot of friction. A very small and exhaustingly vocal minority of players fit right into Visage and insist that any fault is an intended and therefore completely uncritiquable choice on behalf of the developers and therefore cannot be a fault in any way, shape or form. People who get really snarky and shitty when others ask for help, insisting that there's something wrong with the player when their game bugs or they get stuck in a particularly obtuse puzzle, those people can fuck right off. The majority of the Visage player base are far more reasonable. The general consensus is that Visage is a fantastic concept with a struggling implementation. While many understand the intent behind the limited inventory is to produce an atmosphere of scarcity in survival horror, they also concede that the implementation of said inventory is very unintuitive, and not in a James Sunderland fights like a mug because he is a store clerk who's never held a gun in his life, intentional kind of everyman mechanic. Dwayne doesn't spend 15 minutes trying to put his lighter away so that he can hold a sledgehammer in two hands for any reason beyond bad implementation of basic mechanics. Honestly, the horror and atmosphere of Visage is top notch. I challenge anyone to play this game and not get spooked. If you have patience for bullshit, you'd probably really enjoy Visage. It's weird, like, I know my brother would love the horror of the game, but when he asked me if he should try it, I was like, maybe, you might like it. I'd probably recommend using a guide, considering your usual approach. And there are a few guides made specifically so as not to give you any spoilers, but the game is a bit annoying and you might get fed up with it. I personally couldn't finish Visage without relying on a guide at quite a few points. Of all the games I've ever played, the use of a guide is a uniquely accepted approach with Visage. Very few people will begrudge you for this. I know it's possible to play and finish Visage without a guide, but I would probably recommend the game alongside the use of a spoiler-free guide, but let the recommendee decide, how they want to do it. In short, if you've played similar games like Madison and enjoyed them, yes. If you are God's most patient soldier, yes. If you're curious, yes. If you think you'd arrive at a fetus holding a glass ball, try to sledgehammer it, and ping the controller off your grandma's head if the game doesn't let you, maybe give this game a skip. I still choke on my own vomit at the Eurogamer assertion that Visage is a Silent Hill emulator, which it most certainly is not. Visage takes place in a house versus the town of Silent Hill. Visage has a fixed first-person camera versus Silent Hill's third-person camera with occasional fixed camera angles. Silent Hill is combat-heavy versus the combat-devoid Visage. I could go on. While Visage does clearly take some inspiration from Silent Hill in the enemy design and a couple visual details, to call it an emulator is a statement that insults both Silent Hill as a series and Visage as an individual quality experience made with genuine love. Like, we see the influence of Silent Hill in a variety of ways. There are more outspoken ways, such as the big door in the kitchen that's randomly padlocked and chained to all hell, a design choice that clearly serves as a reference to the iconic door that keeps Henry Townsend locked in his little flat in the PS2 Bonanza. We even visit that flat when pursuing an optional Easter egg and trophy, but we also see this in the subtle and best way, the first-person bit. See, Silent Hill as a series only features first-person perspectives in very specific sections. Off the top of my head, the most famous instance of the use of first-person in the Silent Hill games is in Silent Hill 4: The Room. Silent Hill 4 features a little hub, the titular The Room, and a series of places Henry visits by climbing through a hole in his bathroom wall. Yes, it's all very weird and vague, and it's probably a metaphor for circumcision or something, I don't know, let's check the wiki. When outside the flat, gallivanting across time and space, fighting two-headed cloaked babies and huge faces of the girl next door, Henry's escapades are in third-person, fixed camera, the classic Silent Hill format. When returning to The Room, however, Silent Hill 4 switches to first-person perspective, and I'm sure that many of us who've played this can agree that somehow, weirdly, this is when the game is at its most tense. I do genuinely believe that The Room in Silent Hill 4: The Room is the scariest part of the game. Speaking as someone who was too scared to walk through the Museum of Witchcraft in Fallout 4 because it was a bit quiet and something might make me jump, Silent Hill 4's missions, if that's what we were to call them, didn't frighten me in the slightest. Between you and me, I never finished that game completely because I got really fucking bored roaming around subways and graveyards and hospitals. I don't know why. I just found it so dull and so quaint and so fundamentally unscary until I got back to The Room and the sound died out and my camera switched to first person and I was standing in a cold, empty, silent flat with a small field of view and heart palpitations so intense in my chest that I could feel it beating in my shoulders. The Room in Silent Hill 4: The Room is initially a welcome respite after fighting ghosts down on the Earl's Court tube platform. Visiting The Room refills your health, you can sleep there, you can store items there, and you can also just kind of putter about it if you're too scared to carry on to the next mission. It's a safe room, Resident Evil style. Yet around halfway through the game, the nature of this place changes. Returning to the room no longer restores your health, and hauntings begin to spawn. Ghosts crawl out of walls, blood pours from the taps in the sinks, shadows of children stand in gloomy closet doors, and in first person, this scared the shit out of me. If Visage was to emulate any crumb of the Silent Hill series, intentionally or otherwise, I feel so strongly that it plucked that oppressive, uncomfortable feeling from Henry Townsend's apartment and applied it to the house that we wander through. Events that affect sanity have a marked difference on how you move through Visage. The sanity meter quite literally triggering, effectively insta-death if it gets too bad. While the room doesn't have such a mechanic, I feel it's the sanity mechanic in its infancy. Some early version iterated on across the years until finding itself in Visage, for better or worse. I don't know if it's the cynical part of me talking here, but I think it's important to interrogate whether the Silent Hills advertised by this playable teaser would have been good. Since we'll never be getting that game, maybe it's better to just assert no and move on. It's easier to sleep at night under the assumption that we are missing out on absolutely nothing. It's easier to live with Konami's bullshit that way. But realistically, I think there are a few questions to consider when romanticizing an end product we never even got a release date for. PT was, quite possibly, the perfect length to remain terrifying whilst also providing a self-contained, complete experience. Would a quote-unquote full-length version of the game be able to maintain that quality? Lisa, the unkillable constant presence in PT, works so well as an entity of evil because she is so oppressive. Would that be maintainable in a gaming experience any longer than 2 hours? In the Nathan Birch interview, Sad Studios stated, PT served us more as a foundation of this type of horror than anything else. They showed the entire world that you can make people crap their pants with so little, and it's from this aspect that we started Visage. PT was a showcase of a product, so it wasn't hard to expand on something that small and with basically no game mechanics. We decided to extrapolate on the formula of the fear of the unknown. Visage is way more complex than PT in many aspects, such as environmental interaction, character development, storytelling, inventory management, key items, managing your sanity, and avoiding darkness to keep you sane. And whilst obviously Sad Studio are not Hideo Kojima, and most certainly did not have an identical parallel vision for a full gaming experience, Sad Studio clearly lay out the kinds of challenges facing them when adding complexity to a full game. Walking through the same corridor for 2 hours with bare bones mechanics is fine for a playable teaser, but would run dry in a 15-hour experience. When making the playable teaser for Silent Hills, Kojima was forced to produce a tight and efficiently told story with very few moving parts. Behind the scenes videos by Shazez and Lance McDonald demonstrate an extremely clean and careful use of in-game assets to tell a story without any extra physical waste. The map, when viewed out of bounds, is the tidiest bit of game development I've ever seen. Every triggered event is handled as efficiently as possible, probably due to a lack of time or resources. With a full budget and the boundless weight of any resource he could ever want, would Kojima have maintained the same level of restraint for a full game? Would he have told an incredible, subtle story full of subtext and clues to unpack? Or would he have gone his usual route of, audacious flamboyance? Not that audacious flamboyance is bad either, but rather, would we have gotten a Silent Hills game full of protracted, agonizing tension? Or with a 20-hour runtime and the budget of an Egyptian pharaoh, would we have gotten something, a little different? Moreover, why would this game be part of the Silent Hill franchise? From what we saw in PT, the use of that series is arbitrary, seeing that it bears zero similarities beyond being part of the psychological horror genre. Perhaps, and this is my theory, this was the only way Kojima could get a horror game greenlit, by pitching it to Konami as a new entry in their woefully neglected horror series. But should Silent Hills have seen a release, how long do you think it would be before people began to realise that the game was not so much a Silent Hill game as it was a horror game wearing a Silent Hill hat? Will the upcoming horror game OD be a possible glimpse at what Kojima intended to achieve with Silent Hills, only without being pinned to the same ailing IP? Finally, would he put a 5-minute ladder sequence with a fully voiced backing track into a full release? Honestly, I think the main limiter to PT's eventual success as a full game is that I think the initial playable teaser was the full experience. Some have theorized that PT was Kojima's way of expressing frustrations with being tied to Konami. Konami had him on a tight leash, which must have felt suffocating for a game designer whose concepts are so out there. The man wanted to make loads of crazy interesting games, and it seems like his tenure at Konami began to feel crushing, especially since he then went and made Death Stranding, an IP whose main mechanic is travelling was probably anathema to Konami. To discuss this late into the video would be to drag this video out for a whole further 30 minutes, and personally I don't see much merit in pinning on a whole new topic to this video like some vestigial limb. Instead, if you're interested in understanding this theory, check out the video PT's Hidden Meaning by The Great Debate, which I'll link in the description. Essentially, the video communicates the idea that much of the dialogue in PT is secretly written from Kojima's perspective regarding his feelings on his festering time at and relationship with Konami. Listen to the following passage and replace the references to Dad with Konami, and you'll get an insight into why this is such a prevalent theory.
Dad was such a drag. Every day he'd eat the same kind of food, dress the same, sit in front of the same kind of games. Yeah, he was just that kind of guy. But then one day he goes and kills us all. He couldn't even be original about the way he did it. I'm not complaining. I was dying of boredom anyway. But guess what? I will be coming back, and I'm bringing my new toys with me.
Even the idea of walking the same single L-shaped corridor over and over and over again is an exercise in lost luster. As I said all the way back at the start of this video, PT is a game that can only really be fully experienced on a first playthrough, but you spend that time so scared that you can only truly appreciate it once it's over. Any attempts to replay the game and regain that initial terror will only return echoes of that first time. Sure, you might be tense and nervous, but the terror of the unknown, that first heart-hammering scuttle through the halls of PT, will never happen again. PT is designed to be missed. In a sense, this is allegorical to Kojima's time with Konami, retreading the same halls over and over again, wanting to get out and move on. Not necessarily to new companies, but to new games. He proved himself time and time again, but never seemed to be trusted to really spread his wings, repeatedly voicing his wish to move on from the Metal Gear Solid franchise since like 2001. Hideo Kojima joined Konami at age 23 and worked there until 2015. 29 years. Releasing the first Metal Gear for MSX2 in 1987, the series exploded. Synonymous with cinematic storytelling, Metal Gear popularized the stealth genre and soon became one of Konami's most recognizable franchises, earning an estimated $2.5 billion as of 2019. Konami restructured in 2010 with the sudden insurgence of the mobile gaming market, CEO Hideki Hayakawa saying, "At the end of the day, the platform that is always closest to us is mobile. Mobile is where the future of gaming lies." In some ways, this was unfortunately true. Konami saw unprecedented success in the mobile gaming market. Jordan Amaro, who worked on Metal Gear Solid 5 as a designer, said, "Why risk producing pricey and sophisticated games in an age that favors indulgence in shallow, convenient entertainment?" When Kojima developed the Fox engine on which the new Metal Gear Solid game would be developed, he claims that Konami's president called him to ask him to make the next Silent Hill with it, and thus PT was born, and then it was gone. And so Kojima officially left Konami on October 8th, 2015, 1 month after the release of Metal Gear Solid 5. Out of spite, Konami tried to erase any mention of Kojima or his production studio from the promotional material and box art of Metal Gear Solid 5. Despite all of this, he seems to still have genuine love for Metal Gear and is always engaging with fans on Twitter about it with fan art and screenshots. Konami also stopped him from accepting an award at the 2015 Game Awards, threatening him with litigation if he showed up. No one really knows why, but the assumption was that the new focus on mobile-first gaming clashed with Kojima's development style, which some claimed strays over budget and over a long period, although Kojima himself refuted this in a 2016 interview. PT was delisted in April of 2015. Kojima went on to reunite with Norman Reedus and Guillermo del Toro for 2019's Death Stranding, of which he had total control and a blank check from Sony. In 2023, Kojima revealed his next project OD at the Game Awards, an Xbox-exclusive horror game co-written with Jordan Peele. And I don't have an Xbox, so you'll have to enjoy that on my behalf and let me know how it is. In that way, I wonder whether a fully realised Silent Hills would capture the same amount of hopeless, desperate wandering that we had in PT. Like writing a journal entry or venting about your problems to someone else, getting all this out on paper might have been a catharsis of sorts for Kojima. Maybe that was Silent Hills. PT was followed by a few aspirational clones. It's really annoying to try and search for games like PT online, because people in all the threads just assume you mean a horror game, so they fill the replies with bollocks like Dead Space and Alan Wake and Evil Within 2. All great games, but none of which bear a remote resemblance to PT. Layers of Fear naturally followed in 2016, but I didn't love it myself and actually never finished it. It reminds me too much of those haunted house attractions at theme parks, where you basically just walk down a corridor and little animatronic masks start screaming at you, and lights cast the impressions of ghosts over the walls, and cardboard cutouts jump out at you and then get cranked slowly back into their hidey hole for the next cart of people. I know PT wasn't the most complex game of all time, but Layers of Fear felt, to me, somehow even more scraped back, even more one-dimensional. My most anticipated PT attempt was Allison Road, a game announced in 2016 by Lilith Limited. It looked bone-chilling. While it was never officially cancelled, there's not been a real update since the same year, and the developers seem to have all moved on. The Beast Inside came next in 2019, released by Team Illusion Ray. This was easily the most action-oriented PT reimagining, drawing inspiration from Resident Evil 7, and with mostly positive reviews. In 2022, we saw Cycle by 616 Games and Hellseed by Prophenic Studio. Cycle saw an attempt at reimagining PT in PS1-style graphics, keeping the short 30-minute runtime. Hellseed is only in early access, but it looks pretty promising so far. Ultimately, Visage appears to be the most successful PT attempt we have to date, mostly because it's just one of the few that actually ever saw the light of day, but also because it embarked on a genuinely riveting story of crushing psychological horror and took the time to make sure their players were absolutely shitting their britches at the thought of even walking to the kitchen for a snack. And if there's one thing PT excelled at, it was exactly that.